Quick warning before we start to talk about the deluge. And that warning is this: I do not believe in any kind of a god or gods in the spiritual sense. I am not trying to push creationism on anybody. I am not trying to push some sort of a crazy religious, thing on anybody. I just want to go over a legit historical problem that we find when we start to study ancient history. You see, regardless of whether or not you believe in a god or gods, or you're a complete atheist, it's really irrelevant, because when we go and we start studying history, we have no choice but to deal with the religions of the cultures that we are studying. Right? You're never going to understand any of the cultures that were alive back in the day if you do not go out of your way to read their religious texts. Now, the interesting thing about a lot of these religious texts, especially the further back you go, you actually start to find a very interesting situation. And that is that those, quote, religious texts, unquote, are not really all that religious. So the further back we go, we have our ancestors talking about gods and stuff like that, right? Gods fighting up in the sky, gods doing all this crazy stuff and destroying Earth constantly, right? Or humans displeasing the gods up in the sky and all that stuff. Okay. But it's funny, when we go way far back into the very beginning of people's histories, what we find, or I should say in their religions, both, right? It's both, because the reality is people's religions are also their recountings of history. That's basically what I needed to say. So if you don't believe in a god or a god, whatever, gods, or you do believe in a god or gods, then either way, you still have to kind of push aside your preconceived notions or your belief system, regardless of whatever your belief system is. You've got to put those to the side if you have any hope whatsoever to approach history in an objective way. Now, I give this warning for a very specific reason, because nowadays, especially in the Western world, the vast majority of the populations have been preconditioned to immediately discount anything that comes from preconceived religious zealotry or religious works in general. Now, in the West, what's going on is that right now there is a huge focus on demonizing Christianity. And then by extension, it kind of does demonize all the other Abrahamic religions. But what we find is that right now, the current psychological programming that is being injected into the Western world is very much focused on attacking Christians. Now, I'm not going to go get crazy with this, but I do have to point this out because this is why I put the warning on front of the video. Because most people nowadays in the Western world, even if they're huge fans of trying to study history, right? They love the ancient megalithic stuff, they love the pyramids, all that crap, blah, blah, blah. When it comes to possibly using evidence from what they perceive as a religious text, in this case directly, the Bible, but really any religious text is essentially demonized by the current propaganda programming. What this does is this has created a generation, or I guess several generations of people now, who immediately will discard possible scientific evidence simply because they have been told and convinced that anything that comes out of these works has to be fiction. Now, this is a problem because, as I've already stated, a lot of cultures' so-called religions, they are actually just their recorded histories. So if you find yourself in a situation to where you are not going to take serious anybody's, supposed religions, you are immediately cutting yourself out of potential evidence that could help you understand what the past was like. Now, why am I even talking about all this schizo stuff? Well, here's the reason why. Because today I want to discuss the deluge and the possibility of the deluge actually being real. But when people nowadays hear something about the deluge, or more to the point, Noah's flood, that is currently a trigger word. When somebody hears that trigger word, Noah's flood, atheists will generally shut down. And they will further discard any evidence that may be supported by those particular works. Now, once again, it's important to understand why I just kind of called out Christianity, and I only called it out because that's the current religion being attacked and demonized. All religions have these stories, right? It doesn't matter what religion you go to, you are going to find all kinds of crazy stuff going on. The ironic part right now with respect to Western psychological programming is that it's okay to completely go after somebody's Christian faith. But if you go after anybody else's faith, even though they may have more insane stories, that's a big no-no. So right now, the Western world really finds itself in a weird psychological hypocritical bind. And what this psychological hypocritical bind is doing is that it is stagnating any kind of future with respect to us discovering what happened in the past. And I mean the true past. Okay, you're probably wondering, what the hell am I talking about? I thought we were going to talk about the deluge, and now this dude is talking about programming and a little bit of... What the hell's happening? Let me get this out of the way, because it's actually extraordinarily important for everybody to understand what we are fighting against as we are trying to figure out history. So when we want to discuss something like the deluge and take it seriously, because the reality is, this is a serious topic, and it's a huge topic, which we're only going to be able to cover a little bit today if we ever get to it. You know what I'm saying? Okay. But the deluge itself is a problem, because the claim of the deluge is, well, it's technically insane, right? I mean, if you just go off of everybody's histories, and by the way, I mean everybody's histories, we do find a story to where everybody claims that the earth was inundated by water from one hell of a rainstorm. I mean, that's the claim. And then, of course, there's the secondary part to where water seems to come up out of the earth. But nobody really seems to focus on that, which is weird in and of itself, because that's a very interesting problem too. But the main catalyst that everybody talks about is the rain coming down and then flooding the entire planet up to the highest peak. Right? And then, of course, the story gets even weirder across the planet, because for some weird reason, most cultures then also have the Ark story attached to their history as well. So scientifically, we already have a problem. Why do we find a situation to where multiple cultures have the story of a deluge? And then even worse, why do all of these cultures seem to know about some sort of an Ark situation to where life is preserved, stored on board the boat, and then, it goes off, sails around for 40 days, and everybody's bored out of their mind, and then finally, the water starts to recede, and then the boat hits a mountaintop or some crap, and it goes on from there. Anyway, this story poses a serious problem to historians because it is everywhere. Now, the fact that this story is found everywhere is a problem if you are trying to hide the true origins, or at least the true history of humanity. Because if all of us maybe figured out the true history of humans, and I mean the real history, what truly happened, where did humans come from, why are humans here, etc., etc. If we could get that question answered, right? Whatever the answer is, it doesn't matter what the answer it is, okay? It doesn't matter if Marshmallow Man, made us out of honey and sprinkled graham crackers on us and then peed on us, and then poof, humans were made so that he could laugh at us. Even if that was the truth, that, it would be nice to know that, because that would change your life, right? I mean, if a Marshmallow Man made you, you would have a different perspective on you and your family and your friends, right? And you probably question what you're really doing with your life at that point in time. So if we know the truth, things would necessarily change. It's interesting, the truth, if humans can find that truth, and I mean the unequivocal truth, 100% provable, no faith required. If a human can find that truth, it will absolutely psychologically impact that person, and of course people everywhere, to a tremendous degree. Now, what could come out of knowing the truth about human origins? I mean, I don't know. We don't have it, so I can't tell you. But I guarantee you it would not be what we are doing right now. I guarantee you everything would change, and it would have to change. And the reason why is because that, like I said, it would just change the psychology of every single person on this planet. Now, here's where we start to run into problems. So the psychological change that might come over people may be detrimental to certain groups which right now control a vast amount of resources and power on our planet. Let me ask you a question. Do you honestly believe that the people at the top of society right now, and I'm talking about the top people, I'm talking about the people who are not worried about paying bills, they are not worried about hospital, visits and stuff like that. They're not worried about medical care. They have everything situated, right? They will be fed for the rest of their lives because money is a non-issue for these people. These people literally live in a different world than you and me, by the way. I don't mean like a planet. I just mean like the way their lifestyle is. They don't have any of the problems that you and I have. And that's the truth. And the reason why they don't have any of these problems is because right now, essentially, the entire planet is subjugated to the system that these people have created. Now, do you honestly believe if somebody has made it to that level of power, do you think that they are going to jeopardize that power by allowing, the pathetic masses to learn a possible truth that could then jeopardize their stranglehold on all the resources on this planet? Right? No, not in a million years. The people at the top at that level, they're going to exploit the power that they have, the resources that they currently control, and they are going to use those to perpetuate their power structure, right? This is not rocket science. This is extraordinarily basic, simple human psychology, and that's what's happening right now. So, in the West, what's going on now is that we find ourselves in a position to where more and more discoveries, and I mean very interesting scientific discoveries, are being made with respect to what may have happened in our ancient history. And these discoveries are pointing more and more towards validation of quite a lot of ancient religions that we find all over this planet. Now, the deluge is one of these situations that we are starting to realize that we have a ton of evidence for. Not only scientific evidence, but like I said at the beginning of this show, we have cultures all over the planet that record this event. So ask yourself this question. What if the deluge was real? And I don't care if you're an atheist or you believe in something else, doesn't matter. Just for fun, let's do a scientific thought experiment. Let's do that. It's a thought experiment. What if the deluge was real? How would that impact your life? Would that change anything and how you perceive yourself now? Would that change how you perceive history, right? I mean, yes, of course the answer is yes. Let me just cheat for you. Of course, it would change everything. Because if the deluge happened, and if it happened, 6, 12,000-ish years ago or whatever, no, I don't have a date, sorry. And I have not found anybody with a date, by the way. So I don't even have I have maybe a barely general idea, right? 5, 6, 10, 12, 15,000 years ago. But not much longer than that, probably. The evidence does not really support... Anyway, we'll get to that in a bit. Anyway, if you ask yourself that question and you take it seriously, I mean take it really seriously, what would that do? Well, that would necessarily change everything. For example, that would suddenly mean that mainstream geology is wrong. That would immediately discredit countless geologists all over this planet, which then of course would discredit all kinds of students, and then, it would just be a domino effect from there. But what it would also do is it would probably, I would guess, it would probably trigger some kind of primal psychological, intuition or feeling, and it would definitely change the way people act. One of the ways that it might change people is that people may suddenly be like, hey, wait. The system that we support right now, this makes no sense in the context of what may have actually happened in our past. There's no reason to do what we are doing now. We need to refocus our efforts elsewhere. Now, of course, this would cause an immediate crumbling of the system that we are all beholden to right now. And who does this system support? Yeah, we all work our butts off to support a very small group of people at the very top. So, do you honestly believe those people are going to risk that position that they've created for themselves? They certainly, I mean, I guess they earned it, but they earned it in a despicable way, right? And so here's the reality. The answer is, of course, no. These people are not going to give up that power. They have now found themselves with the ability to literally now control the resources of the entire planet, and that goes with human resources as well. And that's how they stay in power. So, one of the things that we now run into in the West is the psychological programming that is demonizing religion. And this, by extension, demonizes religious texts, oral traditions, and archaeological findings as well. That's what this is doing. So if we find ourselves where we can actually point out psychological programming being executed in the West, trying to demonize these events and these concepts that may actually have some truth to them, it begs the question, why? And I've already answered that question basically anyway. The reality is there are people at the top who are not interested in sharing that power with anybody. So with that said, of course, these people are going to do whatever they can to maintain that power. And there's all kinds of things that they have to watch out for. And we're just going to focus on the historical stuff right now. And one of those things is making sure that people all over this planet truly do not remember where they came from and what really happened in their past. And the reason why is simple. If people do not have anything to anchor themselves to, by that I mean if people do not have a past that they can look back on and be proud of, and also just basically know where they came from so that they can kind of guide themselves to where they are going to go, what happens is that people lose their human identity. How do you like that? And that is exactly what is happening in today's day and age, right? There's so much propaganda right now currently directed at everyone on this planet. Make no mistake, everybody's getting hit by this stuff. Right now, the goal that these people are trying to achieve is to essentially sever any kind of connection to the real past so that nobody can have a true identity. And that's what's going on right now. Because if you can kill a person's or a people's identity, that gives you an opening to then create a new identity that you can then exploit. And that is exactly what is happening right now. So in the West, what is going on is that there are psychological programming operations going on that are designed to demonize concepts like the deluge. Right? If the deluge isn't real and it was just a thing that, kind of whatever, there would be no reason to have a 24/7 propaganda campaign demonizing it. You wouldn't need it, because if it was just absolutely 100% false, it wouldn't hold on to anything. There would be no foundation for it to exist in the zeitgeist of any society. Right? And nobody would care. Like, if something isn't real and you have no real reason to believe it's real and nobody talks about it and nobody thinks about it, how much power does that idea really have? Almost none, right? So if the deluge was truly fake and it was only like one or two cultures that maybe had that kind of a story, then you can immediately probably scientifically write it off. Because, law of averages, yeah, you might get one or two cultures on the planet that, they might come across the same idea of, water covering the earth, a boat floating around, and some dude saves the wildlife, and then everybody's hippies. I don't know. If it was just one or two cultures doing that, you could move on. But that's not the case on this planet. We find all cultures have this story all over the planet. And of course, because we find the deluge story everywhere, this causes a problem for historians. And of course, historians don't deal with it. They completely ignore it. So, that's a funny thing to actually talk about, because the fact that historians refuse to look at the comparative mythological aspect of history is really all the proof you need that shows scientifically that modern mainstream historians are hypocrites and liars, and they have zero interest in the truth. Like right here, we just proved it right here, right with this little statement. Because mainstream historians want nothing to do with this, and they won't touch it, right? You can press a mainstream historian on this, and the best they can do is they can just say, oh, well, it's just, it's in human nature to make up a flood story for some magical DNA reason. There are literally historians that will say that. They literally think that this flood story is ingrained for some weird reason in all people's DNA, so that's why everybody came up with it around the same time. That's an explanation that some of these crazy people use, and it just makes you want to run over there and start just start choking, or just slam their head up against the wall and be like, what'd you say? You know what I'm saying? I mean, it's so annoying. Okay, but they do say that. They do say, okay. Anyway, so we can discard mainstream historians. There, pow, gone, easy. It's always good when we can discard garbage, right? Like, elimination is important when we use critical thinking skills. So if we can eliminate stupid historians, great, we can get rid of them. Anyway, I don't mean to call mainstream historians stupid. My bad, I apologize. I'm not attacking anybody. Okay, but check this out. It's not that mainstream historians are stupid, it's that they're ignorant. And unfortunately, a lot of them are willingly ignorant, which is a kind of, I don't know, maybe that makes them guilty. Anyway, but the reality is, why are these historians so eager to completely disregard the flood story? And the reason is because they have been trained to disregard the flood story, right? They're not even allowed to entertain it. So on today's talk, when I finally get to the damn thing, we'll talk about the flood story, and let's see if we can't make it actually happen from a scientific perspective. I'm going to present you guys with concepts and evidence that I don't really see ever talked about all that often, or ever, because nobody, I don't know. It's probably out there somewhere, but we'll cover it here because I've got nothing else going on. And okay, so basically, we find ourselves in a position looking at mainstream historians and really wondering, why is it that they are so quick to dismiss ancient cultures as histories? Why is this? I mean, if they're historians, you would think that they would pay attention to this stuff, right? It's really important for everybody to understand, especially atheists, because atheists will discard religious texts more readily than anybody, is this fact. It does not matter what religious text you're reading, that religious text is a historical document. What I mean by that is that even if every single sentence in that oral tradition or that Bible or whatever is fictitious, if every single word of it is just a fairy tale, it doesn't matter. It is still a historical document because it was written hundreds or maybe thousands of years ago, right? Probably not thousands, that's a whole other problem. But anyway, you see what I'm saying though? Even if it's all fake, it is still an insight into the culture's psychology, and it gives us a picture of what was important to them, possibly what their day-to-day lives kind of may have been, what they were entertained by, possibly what they saw that would have influenced their entertainment and their imagination. You see what I'm saying? Like, you can't just discard a religious text because it's a religious text. Now, what has happened in the Western world is exactly this. We now have a situation to where atheism is being weaponized, not only against all religions, but against atheists themselves. Because what's happening is that the people at the top are currently making sure that there are no alternative perspectives that would allow somebody to possibly get some insight or make a discovery or have something click in their head that would allow them to anchor themselves to their real past, right? The people at the top are not interested in having any of us here know what happened in the past. Now, I don't know if they know what happened in the past. I'm willing to bet that the people at the top know more than us. I'll say that, right? Because at the end of the day, these people have been stealing artifacts for centuries. I mean, they have no doubt that they have huge collections of archaeological evidence that we've probably never heard of and will never see, right? And those pieces of evidence might be the exact things that would help prove, all some, or not all, but maybe some of the crazy stuff that the religions are talking about, right? And what happens if that happens? Well, I already talked about that, right? Everything changes. The psychology of the human would change. So this of course, so this brings us to the key point. If you can control the psychology of a person or people, then you can make sure that you are controlling how they approach problems. And then, of course, you can make sure that they never actually solve a problem that would be detrimental to you. So that's what's happening right now. So we have a situation to where atheism is being pushed hardcore, and the atheists are being used as essentially street thugs to go up against getting rid of any potential truth out there under the guise of destroying it because it's fictional religion. In my opinion, it's very important to understand this perspective, because if we have groups of people right now unknowingly destroying evidence that could potentially explain our past, what does that say about our society? That does not say that we are a high-level functioning society, does it? No, it says that there is some destructive forces on this planet that do not have your best interest in mind. But those people will still serve their masters because they don't even know that they are serving them. Now, I know this sounds like crazy conspiracy stuff, but it's not. Everything I've said so far right now is 100% based on science. The people who are running these psychological conditioning programs, the science is there for them. You can go right now and look at all kinds of experimentations that have been done throughout the last 100 years, and you can see what these people have learned, right? You can see where these people have advanced psychological operations. You can see how they have abused it. There is just an unbelievable amount of scientific evidence that proves all of this. So, I mean, obviously then, of course, it would make sense for the people at top to demonize this whole situation, wouldn't it? Because if you stumble on this stuff and you start to see it for what it is, that means that you know for a fact that there is an enemy working against you that, you should probably go after. And of course, they don't want you going after them. So what they do is, of course, they start up their psychological operations, which basically shuts everything down. Because once you operate at a certain level socially and you have the resources to basically touch the minds of everybody in the Western world, music, movies, internet, etc., and they've got that, right? They own all of that stuff. That's a scientific fact too, by the way. There's not like multiple companies that are all individual and stuff like that. When you dig deep into all of these companies, they all branch up to one parent company, and then that one parent company branches up and out to some other hidden. It's crazy, but it's there. It's scientific. There's nothing to argue with me on that, right? It's right there. You can see it. Anyway, so what has happened is that these people are utilizing their psychological programming to ensure that things like the deluge are not taken any more seriously than, at the very least, just a crazy religious story. So in my opinion, this kind of proves that perhaps the deluge is real. Because like I said, why would you go out of your way to have a 24/7 propaganda campaign acting against a concept like the deluge? Why would you do that? If it didn't exist, if there was no evidence for it, if it was just some kooky, crazy thing and it was irrelevant, in all honesty, they would be doing the exact opposite. How do you like that? They would not be trying to destroy it. They would be promoting it if it was fake. Ha! How do you like that one? That's exactly what they would do. They would actually push the deluge if it didn't happen. Yeah, damn. That's actually an interesting point. Oh man, that's brutal. So for everybody who is not familiar with psychological operations, one of the things that is done and you can do to a person is you can take a perceived fiction, and it actually is a fiction, whatever it is, and then you can push that fiction as being real. You do that long enough, right? What happens is essentially that lie, because that's what it would be. It would be I don't know, it's a fictitious lie, a oxymoron. No, anyway, it would, if you push a lie and you push it long enough, people over time will eventually adopt it. For example, that's exactly what happened with Scaligerrian chronology. When Scaligerrian chronology was created back during the Renaissance period, people all over the place wanted nothing to do with it. People called out the garbage. They said, "No, what are you talking about, Scaliger? Right? This stuff you're making up." And he was literally making up dates, by the way. And these are the dates that mainstream uses now, right? So he scientifically, we know for a fact, made up dates for all these BS events that never happened. But what happened is that Scaliger's work, even though back in the day it was lambasted and it was criticized and it wasn't taken serious by the general population, what happened is that over the generations it was still pushed. So if you have 3, 4, 10 generations to where one very particular narrative is pushed, that narrative will become the truth. And that's the way psychology works. That is a scientific principle in psychological conditioning. There's nothing to argue about. That's what happens. And that is exactly what is now going on with the deluge. All right, we've gone 30 minutes and we are no closer to talking about the deluge because I won't shut up. All right, one more thing and then let's get to the problem. One of the things that I found very interesting that stuck with me over the decades of studying history was, there's a supposed letter written by a man named Albert Pike. And I'll never forget, I don't know why this stuck with me, but it always stuck with me, and it didn't make sense up until maybe about, 8 or 10 years ago for me personally. But one of the things that he supposedly wrote, and this was dealing with creating the Third World War, what he said was this. He said, quote, "We shall unleash the nihilists and the atheists, and we shall provoke a formidable social cataclysm which in all of its horror will show clearly to the nations the effect of absolute atheism, origin of savagery, and the most bloody turmoil," unquote. Now, the thing that stuck with me on this guy was, "We shall unleash the nihilists and the atheists." When I first read this quote forever ago, and I didn't know anything yet, I thought that was the weirdest damn thing to say. Like, how is unleashing atheists, how is that going to start social turmoil? How is that going to create a huge social cataclysm? Because in my mind, if you were an atheist, then you were a free thinker, right? You just wanted to know science, and you just wanted what was best for society. And I think that is generally what most atheists believe that they are shooting for. But what's funny is if you pull yourself back and try to look at society from a lower resolution picture, what you find is that atheists right now, they're like the most unhappy people on this planet. And they're actually causing a ton of problems for all kinds of religious people who are literally just minding their business. Right? You have militant atheists doing all this crazy stuff, and they're causing disorder. They are basically the foot soldiers now of the people up at the top. So this quote now makes a lot more sense to me, because when you unleash nihilists and atheists, what kind of psychological soldier do you now have? You have a person that no longer cares if they live or die, because they're not going to heaven or hell. They think that this is nothing, right? You have one life, you show up, you're a bag of cells, and then you're gone. So what you can do to somebody who thinks at that level is you can use them in ways that you cannot use a religious person in, because a religious person will actually have some fundamental principles that they will generally try to hold on to, right? Or at the very least, some of their principles will not allow them to do certain things that the people up at the top need people to do for them. So if you create nihilists and atheists, These people are essentially just mindless drones because they don't think anything matters. They don't care about consciousness, right? They don't care about anything because they have one life and that's it. And it doesn't matter because you die anyways. So who cares what you do? So they end up having weirder morals. They're more susceptible to all kinds of psychological conditioning, even though they will tell you that they are really intelligent and super smart and could never be psychologically conditioned. Right? Anyway, I just found that fascinating, and sure enough, we are actually living in that world right now. So the fact that people were talking about this over 100 years ago is just fascinating to me from a psychological warfare perspective. Okay, so now that I've basically laid out the fundamentals about maybe why people are not willing to pay attention to the deluge, at least in the scientific side of things, or the mainstream scientific and historical side of things. There are all kinds of people that do actually pay attention to the deluge, but they are marginalized and pushed off to the side by the general system. And that's all by design, and for all the reasons we have just covered. Okay, there's so much to this. We'll have to do a different show on all of this. I've already wasted our time enough. Let's get to the deluge. All right, so the basic claim of the deluge is this. Essentially, at some point in time, humanity gets truly chaotic and rotten, and the god or gods does not like this, and they decide that they are going to wipe the earth clean, right? They're going to cleanse it, get rid of everything, maybe start over. Okay. So what happens is they decide, or the god decides, that they will just cleanse the world with a ton of water, everybody will die, and then everybody should be happy after they're dead, I guess. I don't know. Now, of course, there's another integral part of this story before the deluge starts, and that is there seems to always be a character to where one of the gods comes down to a human and says, "Hey, human, you're about to be wiped off the face of the planet. Build a big-ass boat, and maybe you'll survive. So try to grab everything you can to basically restart Earth." And that's another common theme, which is really weird. It's really weird that we have a flood story that is universal. That's already weird enough. But the fact that we find the Noah-like figure in all kinds of stories as well, how do you account for that, right? How as a historian do you look at that and try to explain it? And of course they don't waste their time with any of that, so they just move on. Anyway, so we have the Noah-like figure there. All right. So then the rain comes. The rain is supposedly supposed to have covered the highest mountain peak. And then, Noah's floating around, slapping people, whatever. And then the water recedes, and then Noah starts everything all up, and, blah, 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 goes on from there. You guys all know the story. Anyway, but there are a lot of similarities that are found in this story from all kinds of cultures. And this, of course, begs the question, why? How the hell did this happen? Now, really quick, for devil's advocacy, people in the mainstream arena will try to say things like, they got the story once they met Europeans, and then, it was integrated into their culture. That is a lie and a falsehood because the stories already pre-exist before Europeans reach them. In fact, you find a lot of people back in the day commenting on this fact, right? They're actually stunned that they have the flood story just like they had the flood story. And this is a common occurrence. So anybody in the mainstream that tries to give you that garbage, you just choke them out or just get rid of them. They're wrong, and you don't need to listen to them. Anyway, so we can immediately cross off any kind of European influence affecting people's histories that, when everybody starts to meet up and starts to intermix. We know for a fact that the flood stories existed pre-European. Now, one thing to note with regards to the flood story is this. When you start to look at people's, religions or whatever, their histories, you find that these histories are told from various perspectives as the history goes on. What do I mean by that? So the first thing we have to acknowledge really fast actually is that all cultures have multiple huge cataclysms that happen within the context of their history, right? It's not just a flood and then everything is all happy afterwards. There's a flood. Then we have fires and floods. Then we have hurricanes. And there's all kinds of crazy stuff that goes on after the flood. The interesting difference that we find is this. When we look at how they recount the flood story is generally recounted more as a kind of a legend type of a story. It's not told from a perspective of, an individual that followed Noah around or something like that, right? It's not told from a person or a witness of the story. The story is very much told as a story. And this is an important fact, I think, to remember when you're reading history, because when you then start to continue to read through the history and you get to the cataclysms that happen after the flood, you find that these cataclysms that are recorded are very much told from a first-person eyewitness perspective, right? There's a completely different methodology in talking about, when the gods were fighting up in the sky and other kinds of cataclysms happened. Those recountings are very much, hey, we were there, we watched this, we did our best to record it, hopefully it was transmitted down the line, right? As opposed to Noah or the Deluge story, which is told very much like you're just reading a third-person book, right? Nobody's really there to witness it. It's not told in the sense of, I was recording and writing this down. It's just some guy in a boat that survives one hell of a huge worldwide flood, and then history begins from there on out. In my opinion, this is an important perspective to remember. Why? So when we go back to certain ancient cultures and we try to figure out where they got the story from, right? As I've said earlier, we can discard the European exploration period, that period between, 12,000 AD to like 1800 AD. We can discard those people having any kind of an influence in creating the flood story. So that's good. But what we do find is that some of these ancient cultures, they actually say they got the story from other people. Interestingly enough, these other people that some of these cultures received the flood story from, they have white skin, blonde hair, red hair, blue eyes, green eyes, gray eyes. Very intriguing. And this is from their history. This is, don't argue with me. If you don't like it, don't look at me. Go argue with the natives. Go argue with those people, because they're the ones making the claim. Obviously, nowadays, it's really difficult to touch on and discuss these very real facts about history, but they are what they are. They are there. This is not me making something up. Like I said, if you don't like it, that's fine. But don't come at me. I'm just repeating what the ancient cultures and the descendants are recording. This is very important to understand. Remember, this is one of the reasons why when Cortez goes over there in South America, why he is considered a god, right? Because they were waiting for those white-skinned people to return. Now, anyway, I'm not going to go into any of that stuff. That's not necessarily the point of this. The main point, or the reason why I bring up this is, that's just one of the pieces of evidence. I can't, some of these cultures, they did not have it intrinsically baked into their entire history. They actually recount that they were told this story by the people that they ran into when they were trying to recover from some sort of horrific cataclysm. So we find ourselves with certain cultures who essentially knew that they were just the stragglers from a previous catastrophe that had completely wiped out everything with respect to whatever their original culture was. They were essentially just wandering survivors. And we find this concept all over the place, right? For example, the North American Indians, they have stories that they say, we were not the natives in America. We wandered over here and wound up in America because we were trying to get away from either one hell of a huge war or one of these amazing cataclysms that just absolutely wiped clean countless civilizations back in the day. So if you have a group of stragglers, right, a couple hundred people who got out of the way of the cataclysm, and they started to procreate over over maybe a few hundred years, right? You get like maybe 6 to 9 generations. If they did not have any of their history physically with them, and they were unable to keep the oral traditions alive, that means they would have lost a lot of their past, and they would have only known about the most recent cataclysmic event, and that is where their history would have started. So they would probably not have had access anymore to the flood story, because the flood story was just gone. So what happens is these people, those cultures who are in this situation, not all cultures are in this situation, by the way. There are just some, which makes sense about, the cataclysmic events. Not all anyway. So what happens is that these cultures who were trying to recover from whatever cataclysm had just happened, not the flood, by the way. This cataclysm would have been, thousands of years after the flood, or at least, well, I can't give you an exact date, but it would have been long after the flood. Let's put it like that. Whatever cataclysm wiped out the original civilizations that retained the knowledge of the flood, those cultures were just wandering around trying to survive. And as they were wandering around, they would bump into other people who had survived the cataclysm, right? And so these people they would intermix, they would start getting together, they would build little civilizations, etc., etc. When this happened, one of the stories that was passed over to these wandering cultures from other cultures that retained the story was of the deluge. So, they'd be like, hey, your ancestors, just like our ancestors, survived the deluge, right? We went through a deluge before the last catastrophe, so don't forget that. And that's where a lot of not a lot, but that's where some cultures get the deluge flood story from. Isn't that amazing? Isn't that weird that some people were so destroyed by other catastrophes that they lost all semblance of their history? And they actually only got some of it back because they ended up running into other survivors from a completely different cataclysm. And of course, like I said, over time they intermingled, and everybody has stories of this intermingling. They would build up new civilizations, and then at some point the people who they ran into, the light-skinned people, they leave, like they disappear, or in some stories they die. And it's not always light-skinned people. There's also stories of other cultures running into nice giants who also have this story as well. Anyway, it's important to remember that not all cultures who have a deluge story, that story is not necessarily ingrained into their history like the rest of the events. A lot of cultures actually acquired this history from other people who just happen to have been able to retain and remember that particular event. Now, this brings us to the next problem. So, the deluge is not the only mega catastrophe that happened on this planet. Like I said, the deluge is probably the first major one, as far as we can tell, because the deluge is what would have ended the supposed golden age that everybody talks about, right? And everybody has that story, and of course it comes to an end when humans get all messed up and start doing drugs and prostitution or whatever, and then the waters come and cleanses everything, and then everything on Earth necessarily changes, right? And we know why this happens scientifically. This would have been, the Saturn event. This would have been the Saturn nova. But we won't get into that. I'm not going to go into that right now. So just looking at what we have talked about so far right now is that the deluge story actually has a lot of other components to it in how it was transmitted. And the way that it was transmitted actually goes a long way into proving the catastrophic events actually happened on Earth. Because if some of these horrible events happen, like the Venus event, the Mars event, some sort of other cometary situations, the kind of destruction that our ancestors talk about, we would necessarily expect the survivors having to deal with situations like this, right? You have survivors all over the planet. No matter how few they were, they still would have been there, and of course they would have all been looking for safety. And since the entire planet would have been changed by these, mega catastrophes, they would have necessarily run into each other eventually And then for survival's sake, they probably would have banded together. And then when they did that, then they would have started sharing stories, recountings, etc. And then, of course, history would have been rebuilt from there. So it's funny, the fact that certain cultures learned of the deluge way back in the day after a completely different catastrophe really does go a long way in proving the situation that everybody claims happened in the past. That the earth was indeed rocked by all these destructive catastrophes. Because we would expect a lot of cultures, if something like the deluge and the other catastrophes were real, I mean, some of these cultures would have literally just lost everything, right? There would be no way of recounting them, because if they were following oral traditions, if all of their oral dudes died off in those catastrophes, then how the hell do you propagate your history? You don't, or you do very little, because if the survivors were not able to retain the information, then there's no way they can carry it forward. And of course, that is what we would expect to find in a catastrophe, and of course, that is what we do indeed find. Now, it's time to ask, is it possible for the earth to have been flooded up to the highest mountaintop by a ton of water? Now, this question sounds insane initially for one very simple reason, right? Volumes and physics. When we look around at the earth, right now we have a ton of water on earth, but all the water is at the lowest points on earth. So right now it does not seem like it would be possible, with the amount of water that exists on earth right now, to have ever been able to cover the entire planet up to the highest peaks. Right? I mean, it is literally simple volumes. We just don't have enough water to truly cover the highest peak. So that's a problem, though, because the stories, they don't say there was just some kind of a local flood that seemed to cover the highest peaks in the area, right? They're very clear about the story. The highest peaks were covered. I mean, the earth was absolutely inundated. And they mean the earth. They're not talking about the area. They're not talking about a continent. They're talking about the planet. So if we take this seriously, how do we reconcile with the fact that right now Earth does not possess enough water to do anything like that at all? The reality is, no amount of rain, no matter what you do, even if you were to suck up all the water in the oceans and try to rain it down on the planet to, fill the earth for 40 days, because remember, the water has to be maintained. It's not just that the highest peak was covered for like maybe, a minute or something by the highest point in the water. Now, the claim by all of our ancestors is that the highest peaks were covered for an extended period of time. So, if we are going to make the claim that the deluge actually happened, we have to reconcile this problem. How the hell do we cover the highest mountain peaks? I actually have an answer for you, but here, really quick, let's look at the other side of the story really fast before we get into the answer. So the mainstream, they don't touch any of this stuff. The deluge never happened, whatever, blah, blah, blah. It's all religious, fictional garbage. We throw it in the trash. Okay, so we can discard mainstream because they are no help. The next people that we can go to the religious people. Why not, right? Nowadays, there's all kinds of religious people who are also scientists. Right? And, so initially you think, all right, good, and good on them, actually. No, I'm not talking crap. No, it's good. So what these guys are now doing is they're trying to figure out a way to reconcile this problem, right? These guys are approaching it from a scientific perspective, but, they got to figure out a way to make it jive with the Bible, for example, in this case. So what I'm finding, or what I'm seeing these kinds of people do, is they are slowly pulling away from listening to their religious text. And this is unfortunate. So what we're finding with modern day Christian scientists is that they are now saying, well, I mean, it's not really that the flood covered the highest peak. I mean, maybe just people, they were just over exaggerating. The flood was just so crazy that, it seemed like the highest peak was covered and the whole world may have been covered because of the extremeness of the local flood in an area. So this is the perspective that they take, but they still have to figure out where the hell a mega flood of any kind of a situation like this would come from. What these Christian scientists are now doing is they have now bought into the Ice Age situation. And by the way, we have no reason to believe there was ever such a period on Earth called the Ice Age. All of the evidence that is used to support the Ice Age theory can be, or I should say, is being interpreted only in one way by Ice Age scientists. And of course, those interpretations are what will fuel the supposition that eventually creates the Ice Age period. And now everybody thinks that that is real because the Ice Age, once again, you tell a lie long enough, it will become the truth. It doesn't matter how smart a person is. In fact, I think I've said it before, but the smarter a person is, the easier it is to psychologically control them. So the Ice Age has been injected into the mainstream zeitgeist, and now not everybody, but a lot of people believe in it. And then, of course, the Ice Age is now used as an excuse to explain other stuff that had no explanation originally. And, anyway, it's like a huge domino effect. And I know most people probably listening to this believe in the Ice Age, and you also probably think the Younger Dryas is a real event. As a side note, the Younger Dryas is just people coping with not wanting to look at the evidence for what it truly means. The people who buy into the Younger Dryas, they are willing to look into that because it's still relatively tame compared to what all of our ancestors are actually talking about. But, they're looking at it from a very mainstream scientific perspective. And so that's kind of where they're getting comfortable with. But of course, the Younger Dryas does not answer any real catastrophic question. Okay, anyway, back to the Christian scientists. So what Christian scientists are doing is they're saying, hey, look, in North America, there was a huge ice sheet, and then there was this magical huge ice lake and this magical ice dam, and this ice dam eventually melted and broke, which allowed a huge flood of water to sweep over a chunk of the North American continent. And there is indeed evidence for water flow on the North American continent. The problem is we have zero reason to believe that there was a magic ice dam that caused this. All right. So anyway, what Christian scientists are ironically doing is they are not listening to their religious text. Right. The text is very clear. Highest peaks of the entire planet were covered in water. What Christian scientists are doing is they're saying this ice dam broke, and yeah, it was one hell of a huge flood, and that's where the story came from. Of course, that does not meet the criteria in any capacity for the deluge situation. So, it's funny. The Younger Dryas and this ice dam garbage, it's all just coping mechanisms for people who are absolutely terrified of the truth. Okay, so anyway, that's that side. So when you study the deluge, you're going to find that stuff. Just be wary. Remember, ask serious questions. If somebody is going to tell you that an ice dam broke, they better have proof for that ice dam. And of course they don't. And what they get to say is well, bro, it's an ice dam. It melted. It's gone. I can't prove it. You just need to believe me. This is what we're at right now. This is what scientists literally want us to do. They just want us to, they literally operate on, trust me, bro. That is literally all mainstream science is nowadays. Okay. Anyway, but so Christian scientists are now on this weird track. I don't know where they're going, but they are trying to cope with it. The funny part is that we do see water flowing over there, but those Christian scientists and other scientists as well, they never stop and think, maybe this could have been a completely different flood situation that all of our ancestors talk about as well, especially in North America. It's just, actually this leads to another problem with the deluge. A lot of researchers, both mainstream, alternative, religious, whatever, a lot of people make the mistake of not listening to the historical texts, right? There is a very particular chronology in these texts, right? You have a period of the deluge, right? The deluge is its own event. And then as the history goes on, you have other mega flood events, as well as, firestorms and hurricanes and all that other stuff. But it's very chronological. Nobody says that all of that happened during the flood. They say that happened later on, right? It was a completely separate problem that everybody had to deal with. What's happening nowadays is that researchers are ignoring the chronology. researchers are no longer paying, not all researchers, but a lot of researchers are lumping all mentions of a mega flood or mega floods into the deluge concept, and they're saying, well, there you go. See, our ancestors were dumb monkeys. They just split the floods up. But the reality is there may have been some kind of a big flood, but they thought it flooded the entire planet, and we don't know why they have multiples, but it's all the same flood. So we put it all together, and that's why our monkey ancestors think there was a deluge. Like, that's what happens. Like, everybody ignores the chronology now, right? Because nobody wants to look at the fact that our planet has suffered not just one global mega catastrophe, but multiple global catastrophes that have absolutely wiped out multiple civilizations throughout history. And this is what the science shows us, of course, but people have a hard time reconciling that because they've been trained to not think something like that is possible. And that's really what it is at the end of the day. People who cannot look at the evidence for what it is, the reason why they can't look at that evidence correctly anymore is because they have been psychologically trained to look at it through a completely different light. Their tool set for analyzing evidence is very, very limited, right? Because they don't want to be mocked. They don't want to be ridiculed. They don't want to be called a conspiracy theorist, all that crap, right? They're deathly afraid of all of that. They have been psychologically conditioned to be afraid of all of that stuff. So that's why we find the younger dryas, cope. I just call it the younger dryas cope, and it's because that's all it is, right? Or the ice age situation, also another coping mechanism. All right, so when you go out there and you study the deluge, you are going to run into these situations. Don't ignore them, by the way. So the Christian scientists right now who are trying to deal with this ice dam situation breaking and trying to explain why there are all of these hardcore fluid dynamic leftovers up there in the geology in North America, these people are actually making legitimate geological discoveries. The problem is that it's a completely different event that they are ascribing this magical ice dam to. And, that event is more than likely the Venus event is what they have found, but they don't realize that they are talking about the Venus event. Now, the Venus event happened after the deluge. So what they're looking at right now is relatively newer evidence for a catastrophe that happened after the deluge. This actually brings up another point that we have to be aware of, and that is the deluge is not the only mega catastrophe that hit Earth. The deluge was the beginning of multiples that would strike over the centuries and the millennia. So we've actually find ourselves in a situation to where the reality is the vast majority of the evidence for the deluge has probably been wiped clean from this planet by the subsequent catastrophes. So, for example, the Venus event. If Earth did indeed encounter Venus in a cometary form crossing the Earth's orbit, and, Venus did drag a huge mountain of ocean water over the North American continent, that would have obviously destroyed all kinds of evidence for the deluge in North America, right? But what this does explain is this explains why those Christian scientists are finding the kind of fluid dynamic evidence that they are over there, because it's not the deluge, it's the Venus event, a completely different flood, which fits infinitely better within that bit of evidence that these Christian scientists, for example, are working on. This would be the Missoula floods, by the way, for all of those of you who are into geology. The Missoula, I don't know, whatever. The Missoula floods, that theory, or not the theory, we know that the water ran up there. That was more than likely caused by the Venus event. It has nothing to do with the deluge. Remember, the deluge covers the whole planet. Right? So there would not be these huge rushing water areas only in a small part of the planet. The water would have covered the entire Earth, right? So it doesn't even make sense. I don't even know why these guys are wasting their time. It's not even. Anyway, Just keep in mind that subsequent catastrophes that hit Earth would have wiped clean a lot of the evidence, or at the very least, it would have scrambled the hell out of it. So we have to keep that in mind, right? Because, and then of course, other catastrophes would have screwed up, earlier and it gets messy, basically. And so that's one of our problems right now. When we go and we try to interpret geological evidence or any kind of scientific evidence, we have to contend with multiple chaotic events, either wiping out evidence entirely, altering it, or completely changing everything else about what could have potentially explained what had happened during the deluge. So what does that mean? If the Earth was hit with other catastrophes, and these catastrophes literally altered the entire face of the planet, that gives us a potential into understanding how the deluge could have covered the highest peaks. It's going to be important to listen to not only the story about the deluge to understand the deluge, but it's going to be important to learn about the subsequent catastrophes that altered the face of the Earth. Now, this is the key. When we look at the catastrophes that happen in diluvian times, basically times after the deluge, we find everybody talking about mountain ranges springing up overnight. We find continents sinking overnight. We find all kinds of absolutely insane geological processes happening overnight and not over billions of years. If the catastrophes that hit Earth after the deluge raised all of the mountain ranges that we see today, and by the way, this is exactly what all of the histories record, suddenly we now have to look at the deluge in a completely different geological light. It begs the question, if we find a situation to where ancient cultures can recount the creation of mountain ranges and other crazy geological situations, what did the planet look like before the other cataclysms created all of the other geological formations? What I mean by this is, for example, the Sierra Nevada mountain ranges. It's a huge mountain range, and it actually basically connects down to the Alps. They're all one huge mountain chain. Anyway, the Alps and the Sierra Nevadas, all of the ancient cultures that lived around there during a very particular period of time, these cultures actually have stories of what created those mountain ranges. And of course, these stories come long after the deluge had already hit and had been essentially either long forgotten or was just a myth even to those guys, right? Because remember, like I said, the deluge story is not told in the sense that the rest of ancient cultures' histories are told. It's told very much just as a story. Anyway, so if ancient cultures have stories for some weird reason of these mountain ranges being created during these catastrophic events, that means that these mountain ranges did not exist during the deluge. If we find a situation to where all of these really tall mountain peaks, right, 18,000 plus feet high mountain peaks, literally didn't exist, and the highest mountains were maybe 1,000 or 2,000 feet, suddenly trying to flood the entire planet becomes a completely different problem, doesn't it? Because now we are not trying to fill the Earth up to 18,000 feet above sea level. We only need to go about 1,000 or 2 feet above sea level. It gets even more interesting because we have no reason to believe that the current continental shelves or the outlines of the continents that we see now existed back in the day. In fact, we know for a fact that the way that the continents are structured now with the shorelines and the outlines that we are all familiar with, those would have never existed back in the day either. It's entirely possible that all of these deep trenches in the ocean never would have existed. In fact, it's entirely possible that the concept of oceans did not exist until after the deluge. If Earth was more of a uniform sphere, if we did not have all of these huge chasms in the ocean and all of these tall mountains in the sky, and if the continental shelves either existed completely differently or didn't exist at all, flooding the planet is now a much easier possibility. This is what I see historians and everybody make the mistake all the time of doing, is that nobody factors in the chronology of the catastrophes and how the catastrophes would have shaped the planet, and by extension would have shaped the histories and the recountings. Remember, anybody who would have survived after the deluge, the geography of the planet would have been completely alien to anyone living several thousand years later, right? So the Mayans over there in South America, living in South America the time that the Mayans lived in, it would have been a completely alien area if anybody from the deluge period was brought forward in time to look at it. It wouldn't even be recognizable. Everything would have been different, right? The plants would have been different. The geology would have been different. The ocean would have, everything would have been different, because the people, who survived the deluge, they had not had to worry about the subsequent catastrophes yet, right? The planet had only just been hit with a ton of water. It had not been hit by the other cosmological events yet. So it's important to remember that when you are reading ancient histories, you have to remember that when people are recording their histories, they may be recording their histories during a time when Earth looked absolutely nothing like it looks today. This is probably one of the main number one mistakes that historians and scientists fall for. They honestly believe the theory of uniformity is real. So by extension, they honestly believe that everything takes billions of years to change. So if somebody's talking about a history that's, say, only, 5,000 years ago, they think the planet looked like it did now back then, when the reality is that it is the exact opposite. Not only do the histories of the ancients recount this, right? There are mountain ranges that don't exist until a very particular period of time when our ancestors actually record seeing them being created, right? For example, this is just a reality in the stories. So if you are not factoring in the different perspectives relative to the time period that you are looking at, you really are never going to be able to get a true grasp of what these people were dealing with, because you're looking at it through your lens right now. The way the Earth is now is not at all the way it was back in the day. Now, this isn't only just corroborated by, the histories that all of the ancients talk about. All we have to do is take 2 seconds to go and find all of the countless civilizations that are right now currently underwater, right? How much underwater archaeology exists on this planet? Tons, like an absolutely ridiculous, insane amount of cultures are now lying in ruins under oceans, lakes, etc. Right? So we know for a scientific fact that all kinds of civilizations have been flooded out or sunk below the waves, and we have all the evidence to prove it. Even funnier about this whole thing is that all of these civilizations that are currently ruins under the oceans and the seas, even mainstream scientists are willing to admit that these things sunk relatively recently. Right? Because that's what the archaeological evidence shows. These are not civilizations from 1,000,000 years ago. We have wreckage right now, for example, in the Mediterranean, right? The Mediterranean is full of wreckage underneath the water down there, and all of those civilizations are technically relatively recent. So how the hell does a mainstream person reconcile seeing all of these civilizations buried under the water, but then also say that the Earth has not suffered from any major catastrophes in the past few thousand years? The whole thing is ridiculous. It's just absolutely stupid. Anyway, context is key when we are reading this stuff. So when we look at the deluge situation, we can then prove that the Earth's geological situation, or the geography of the Earth back then, is not the same as it is today. That opens the door for flooding the Earth. Now, The next question that we have to answer is, where the hell does all of the water come from? Because if we are going to make the claim that, oceans didn't exist, or at least they didn't exist like they do now, and if the geography of the planet was different, we still need to figure out where the hell the water can come from. Good news here. We actually do have a scientifically viable way of explaining where the water came from. Now, this is actually a good segue into explaining how the deluge could have happened exactly like our ancestors say. So, before the deluge happens, the earth is in a completely different situation than it is in now. Remember, we are going to take the texts seriously. So if we are going to take what they say about the deluge seriously, we are then by extension going to take what they say seriously about what happened pre-deluge, or in antediluvian times. And of course, in antediluvian times, we find Earth is essentially a paradise. Earth is in a completely different situation than it is in today. And this is where researchers make their first major mistake. Researchers think that the Earth would have still been in the exact same orbit that it's in right now, that nothing would have changed, and that anything that would have happened in the past, it would have happened with Earth being in the situation that it finds itself in the solar system today. By that I mean, the orbit we have now, the Earth would have had it back then, apparently. Right? We have no reason to believe this, though. And in fact, we have every reason to not believe that. In fact, when we go and we read these stories, we find out that everything is completely different. The historical and religious texts make this very clear. The sun that we orbit now was not our original sun. And this is a theme all over the planet. So what does that mean, right? What do you mean we're orbiting a different sun? Well, if we were orbiting a different star at the time the deluge hit, that means that the Earth's environment would be completely different astronomically. If Earth finds itself in a completely different astronomical position, that means we now have access to other processes that we don't see acting on Earth today. Right? There could have been other stuff going on way back in the day during the deluge period that could have indeed created an environment to where something like the deluge could have happened. If the Earth was orbiting a different star, say a brown dwarf star, and we were nestled within its plasma sphere, suddenly we find ourselves in an environment that could potentially create the deluge. If Earth was orbiting a brown dwarf only 6, 10, 12,000 years ago, whatever the age is, it's not that long ago. That's the main point. If Earth was indeed orbiting a brown dwarf, with other planets as well, by the way, one of the things we would have found is that Earth would have been being illuminated and warmed uniformly over the entire face of the planet, because of the way the brown dwarf's plasma sheath radiates energy. There would have been no poles, there would have been no, ice caps or anything like that. Earth would have generally been blanketed in a nice, general, warm glow that may have apparently been purple, which then, of course, might have been where this concept of the purple dawn comes from. That's not for sure 100%, but it is very interesting. Wall Thornhill points that out. We don't have any 100% proof for something like that, but a brown dwarf star would indeed radiate that kind of a colorful glow. Anyways, if that's what our ancestors are talking about, and they do, that means there might be some potential there. Anyway, long story short, to get the water to flood the Earth, what we would have needed is some sort of a catalyst to kick off an event that would essentially drench the Earth in tons of water. And sure enough, our ancestors describe exactly that event. So, what could have happened is that Earth was once orbiting a brown dwarf, and in this case, the brown dwarf would have been Saturn. Now, Saturn would not look like it looks today. Saturn would have just looked like a nice soft purple brown dwarf. We would have been within its, magnetic plasma sheath. When we're in there, what could have happened is that if Saturn electrically made contact with another electrically charged body, this would have caused the entire Saturnian system to go to hell in a handbasket. Now, I'm not going to cover the entire Saturnian breakup and all the science behind that. I just want to focus on where the water came from. Yeah, you like that? I'm trying to focus on one problem, and we're already well over an hour. Okay, so anyways, if the Saturnian brown dwarf made electrical contact with another electrically charged body, in this case, the current sun, everything would have gone crazy. When everything goes crazy, one of the effects that would have happened is that the brown dwarf Saturn would have started shedding charge. The reason why brown dwarf Saturn would start shedding charge is because it would be trying to acclimate itself to its new electrical environment. And that would basically be trying to deal with the much larger body of the sun, right? The sun's a charged body as well. The sun just absolutely slaps Saturn around when we all enter the sun's orbital situation. Anyway, I'm really trying not to get into all of that. Anyway, one of the processes that would have been going on when Saturn starts shedding charge and matter and stuff like that while it's trying to acclimate, one of the byproducts that is inherent in a brown dwarf star, and by the way, this has been proved by NASA. This is mainstream science. So if you don't like what I'm about to say, don't argue with me. You can literally go argue with NASA, I guess. You can go talk to those bastions of truth. Anyways, what was discovered is that brown dwarfs actually contain quite a lot of water. Water is not rare in space. Anyways, so if we have a catastrophic event going on to where Earth is now basically going through a cosmological car wreck, we're flying around a brown dwarf Saturn, and Saturn is starting to shed water, guess where all the water comes that could have created the deluge? The water could have come from space. And this is a very simple, general scientific process that would have created an environment where essentially while Earth was breaking free of the brown dwarf Saturn, we would have been inundated with water. So you could technically flood the entire planet if you have a brown dwarf star essentially raining just metric tons of water down on the planet just constantly. Remember, this event goes on for, in some books, 40 days, 40 nights, right? That's the general time frame. It's not an overnight process, but it's not a million-year process. While Earth is trying to, acclimate itself and it's going through this cosmological car wreck, it's just going to be constantly bombarded with rainwater from space. How do you like that? Now suddenly the deluge comes to life. Suddenly the deluge is a real possibility. But it's only a possibility if we are willing to look at the real history and the real science and take an objective look at this. Now, I'm going to close this up because I've been talking way too long. What we covered today basically allows us to scientifically and historically prove that the deluge is a real possibility. So when our ancestors are recounting this history, this may have actually happened. And if this actually happened, just think about the ramifications and what that means for humanity. It changes everything. And in fact, the implications go even further when you start factoring in things like, like the Anunnaki or other humanistic-looking gods or whatever. It gets insane. The possibilities here and the ramifications of what this could mean for the human species and life in general, it's crazy. And it changes everything. So there may actually be people on this planet right now who know the truth, who know this stuff, and maybe know even more, and they know if they can control it, then they can essentially control the human population. And then to make matters worse, it really begs the question, was the human population designed to be controlled, like the histories say. Okay, I'm going to close this up. See, it gets crazy, and we could talk about this for 10 million years, and screw it. We'll keep going on later with more of this show. But see, this sets a scientific stage to make a claim that the deluge may have happened. So don't just throw this story out when you hear it. Try and take it seriously and factor in the real new sciences from plasma physics into all of this stuff, and factor in real cosmology. And well, we might find the answers to a lot of the stuff that we have been looking for.